want to talk to you about a very important subject that many people perhaps have not yet seen, and I call it the arrival of the post-secular era. No one was expecting the disappearance of the secular domination, right? And you probably all hear of warnings about the influence of secularism in our universities and everywhere else in the culture. And there's a reason why that's the case, because we have seen a virtual dominance of secular humanism in Western society for a number of centuries. When I went to the States for the first time in 1964, the Cold War was at its hottest, and the Americans I met were afraid of the commies, the invasion of Marxism, the godless system that they saw spreading through from the Soviet Union to China and Korea and Vietnam and Cuba. And they saw it as a great threat to Christianity. But they didn't see it as the invasion of a religious system, but the invasion of non-religious materialism. That was the great threat. Non-religious materialism. It was in two forms. In a political form, atheistic Marxism, and in an intellectual form known as secular humanism. So that's been the great threat in Western culture for a long period of time. And, you know, till very recently as well. What can we say about the history of secular humanism? In the 15th century, humanism became popular in the Renaissance, which believed at that moment in the 14th and 15th centuries that humanity was being reborn according to the ancient pagan Greek model of rational thought, based on the well-known saying of Protagoras in 490 to 420 BC, man is the measure of all things. Thus began in the 15th century the serious questioning both of the authority of the church and really of the authority of the Bible. In a certain sense, it was probably good that people felt that they were able to question the dogmas of the Catholic Church, and we owe the success of the Reformation to that ability to put into question those dogmas. But very soon people were already saying that the only source of truth was human reason, and that we were also autonomous to the Word of God. And so you have in the 17th century thinkers like Hobbes, Descartes, Locke. René Descartes said, as you remember, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, making thinking the fundamental beginning point of meaning. And we have seen since that time the vast achievements of Western science and technological inventions. So who could put into question secular humanism? But of course, with that good came the belief that independent human thought was the only norm of truth, and that things spiritual were merely superstitious primitive myths. And so you have developing in the 18th to the 20th century the so-called Enlightenment Project, a powerful optimism in the capacities of mankind to bring about a better world using his reason. It was almost a religious system if you take the example of the French Revolution, when in 1789 the Paris revolutionaries built an altar to the goddess Reason right in the middle of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Talk about a fist against anything spiritual, and that was considered the one form of religion. The French revolutionary Voltaire made the amazing statement, "Écrasez l'infâme, écrasez l'infâme." And the infâme, or the vile thing, was Christianity. So that was the goal of the French Revolution, according to Voltaire. This powerful expression of human thought predicted the disappearance of religion. And some of the leading thinkers did exactly that. Ludwig Feuerbach called Christianity a delusion and God a gigantic human projection. Unbelief is not simply modern. This is in the very early 19th century. Karl Marx, as you know, called religion the opiate of the people. Friedrich Nietzsche said, "Gott ist tot," God is dead. Sigmund Freud, at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, said that religion was a mass delusion, a collective neurosis that could only be helped by therapy. In our modern world, Richard Dawkins in 1976 continued on that kind of negative approach by describing Christianity as a kind of mental illness. So the great belief was that the truth of secular humanism would ultimately cause religion to wither away. Indeed, when I studied the New Testament at Harvard in the late 60s, demythologization was the rage. That is to say, the attempt systematically to get rid of Christian superstition in the New Testament and reinterpret spirituality as existentialism. And that was what was being taught as the essence of the Christian faith. Darwin, of course, effectively eliminated faith in God when he argued that all things descended from a common ancestor via random events. Not a common designer, but a common ancestor. The disappearance of religion and of God seemed certain when I was studying in my first degree for theology and was asked to study the death of God movement. Theologians like Altheiser, Vahanian, Van Brunen, and David Miller were publishing books on the death of God. And I remember myself and my fellow students were convinced that this was proof that secular humanism had won. And indeed, my professors said the same thing, so we were confirmed in that kind of thinking. And we have seen the effect of secular humanism in our time with the demise of the Christian religion as a really dominant social force in Western society, so that whenever the church speaks forcefully to a public issue, it is castigated as coercive, hate-filled, and out of date. Indeed, I follow American politics, And in August of this year, the Democratic National Committee praised the values of the religiously non-affiliated as the essence of the Democratic Party. These people are proposed as the paragons of secular morality who will ensure, quote, that policy is driven by science and evidence, not sectarian beliefs, that is, religion. But something strange happened on the way to the 21st century. Secular humanism began to wither. I wonder why. Well, some argue that it produced two devastating world wars. Its political theory produced totalitarian fascism. Stalin, Hitler, and Pol Pot, the great exponents of secular humanism, were guilty of the murder of millions of innocent human beings. Secular humanism, if man is the measure of all things and that the human reason will save us, actually produced the fear of nuclear extermination, industrialization, ecological disasters, and soulless materialism. So it wasn't doing too well as we saw the 20th century moving along. And modern science itself seems to have contributed to this demise when it has to believe that quantum physics and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle show us that we cannot finally know rationally what is the true nature of physical reality. And then, of course, secular humanism was really fundamentally undermined by the postmodern critique. Postmodernism deconstructed reason by arguing that human reason is limited, is situated, and has no ultimate connection with anything objective. Everything we say is socially generated. There is no rational truth, and mega-narratives are not to be believed. It's interesting that this attack on rational truth really is an attack on postmodernism itself, which claims to make true statements. So it too is situated, and therefore we cannot really believe what it says. And so we are in a crisis of meaning, as a matter of fact. If postmodernism has undermined the objectivity of secular humanism, but then undermines its own critique of secular humanism, where does truth lie? I think this is part of the crisis that is pushing secular humanism in a very different direction. But I haven't finished talking to you yet about the failure of secular humanism. We certainly see in certain cases the critique of atheism by some of the most well-known atheists. Anthony Flew, a renowned atheist of the 20th century, almost to the end of his life, argued finally, because of the mystery of personality and thinking and the self-conscious human being who cannot be explained from pure physics or chemistry, cannot therefore justify belief in secular humanism. There has to be an origin outside. He said, matter cannot produce conceptions and perceptions. Such a world has to originate in a living source or mind. That was the great atheist of the 20th century. I was reading in a book on Hinduism by an American Jew who became a Hindu, but he states in this book, which is entitled American Veda, if you want to read it, I was a political radical. I had no use for religion, but I was disillusioned with Marx and Freud. So here you have an example, right, of a secular humanist who is now telling the world that he was disillusioned by secular humanism. And he says the descriptions of enlightened yogis and the sublime faces on Buddhist statuary made me think I wanted what those guys have. I wanted union with the cosmos. So here's a testimony, you see, of a conversion of a secular humanist into a spiritual pagan. Another example of this conversion is the Reverend Lauren Artress, once a classical liberal, now what would you call her? A progressive liberal. She states, she actually is a priest at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco and has made the use of the labyrinth a worldwide phenomenon, which is a pagan system of getting closer and closer to God by walking in the labyrinth until you get to the center. You get to the center of yourself where you find God. That's a technique that has been used in spirituality, in paganism, down the history. And she was one of these classic liberals rejecting the supernatural. But then she says, she awakened to enlightenment. We mistakenly thought that the intellect was the avenue to experiencing the sacred, to nourishing the soul. We discounted the imagination and our other faculties of knowing mystery. So the old liberal became a new liberal with a determined adoption of pagan spirituality. I mentioned to you that I was in a class studying the death of God theology, convinced, like my fellow students in the 60s when we were doing it, that this was proof that secularism had won. But we didn't know one thing that was absolutely essential to know at that moment. One of these death of God theologians by the name of David Miller produced, or was producing at that time, and a few years later the book came out, a book entitled The New Polytheism, where he predicted, and I quote, "At the death of God, we will see the rebirth of the gods and goddesses of ancient Greece and Rome." Does that tell you anything about what's happening to secular humanism? That instead of simply killing God, you reinvent who God is. And that gives you a new lease on life. I didn't know that this David Miller actually was a lifelong follower and friend of the psychologist Carl Jung, who also taught in the places where Jung was teaching. And so he had discovered through Carl Jung, and since we're in the process of promoting Reformers Bookshop, my book, The Other Worldview, do I get the title right? I always forget the titles of my books. The Other Worldview follows this process, and you'll have a very fascinating chapter. The Other Worldview, she proved it to me, thank you. There's a fascinating chapter there on Carl Jung and his influence in the West that had been totally dominated by secular humanism, his influence on bringing people through his theories of psychological health into a belief in pagan myth. And so, little by little, you see the indications that for a number of people who were secular humanists, there's another way to go. They're looking for something more convincing than what secular humanism could deliver. And I was surprised myself to discover this term, post-secular. Now we're all used to postmodern and post-Christian, but post-secular. I thought the world was going to become more and more secular. What's this about the post-secular? Well, it was in the title of a book that came out in 2009, Post-Secularism, The Hidden Challenge to Extremism. Now that's an interesting subtitle, written by a British intellectual, Mike King. And he's proposing post-secularism as an avenue between extremes. What are the extremes? Well, on the one hand is the extreme of ridiculous faith in theism, the Christian faith, right? The other extreme is extreme atheism, that rejection without thought of other things and simply affirming atheism as the only way forward. So this post-secularism is proposing, you see, an avenue between theism and atheism. Now, what do you have in between theism and atheism? Pantheism. That's the other option. Atheism, theism, in the middle is pantheism. And I believe that's what this post-secular era is discussing and getting into as the truth about nature. But I thought it was interesting that this title, Post-Secularism, The Hidden Challenge to Extremism, was trying to avoid the two extremes of Christianity on the one hand and atheism on the other hand. We'd always thought that secular humanism was for atheism, but now apparently it's different. Your own Australian scholar Malcolm Hollick, in his 2006 book, The Science of Oneness, defines the new science this way. The science of oneness is non-dogmatic. It draws inspiration from all disciplines and faiths. It steers a middle course between the opposing dogmatisms of religion and science. Theism and atheism, if you like. So we need a new kind of religion that can conjoin the religious left with notions of social justice and scientific rigor. So we need to be really intelligent pagans. But it is interesting that for secular humanists who want to go in this direction, it is a turn to irrational superstition. Something that rationalism and secular humanism for so long was rejecting as unworthy of the human being, now suddenly becomes valid. They, at that point, were rejecting the Christian notions of God, also notions of the occult concerning the paranormal. All that was dismissed as superstition. But Carl Jung, as I mentioned earlier, was opposing, quote, the tyrannical intellect of Enlightenment secularism. You see that? Carl Jung, who pushed his psychological theories into the West, was opposing secular humanism. And frankly, Jung convinced a lot of secular humanists to go his way. Jung said, "We are living in what the Greeks call the kairos, the right moment for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principles and symbols." In other words, he was calling for a new religion, what he called a unitary religion, precisely bringing some elements together that had long been held apart. And so some of these post-secular thinkers argue that the human mind has more cards in its deck than it has been playing with in the past, and needs to seek new ways of knowing. Michael King proposes 4 elements in this post-secular view of things, or 4 elements that are behind the progress of the movement. And it's interesting because I didn't know this when I wrote my book and made such an emphasis upon Carl Jung. But this scholar says that the first important influence is Jung's psychology as the essential bridge into the post-secular world. In his broad engagement with spiritual reality. You should read at least, maybe, Tom, you could give him a simple, a smaller price just to be able to read chapter 3, I think it is, on Carl Jung. But it is fascinating to discover that Carl Jung actually, even though he was considered a great academic, was into the occult. And if you buy his book, which I did, the red book, which is this big and this thick, costs you $200 American, in which are written his honest statements about himself, which were kept secret until his death. And in that book, he describes his experience with the occult. He had a spirit guide named Philemon, who would appear before him and lead him into the mysteries of the pagan world. And this is the man, you see, that was considered the great intellectual expert, academic in human psychology. And so it's not surprising that Michael King proposes that Jung is a fundamental element in the emergence of the post-secular. He also relates what I said earlier, the new science of quantum physics, where the human being runs the machine joyously coextensive with and co-creator with the cosmos. A very spiritual notion of science. He talks about a rediscovery of nature spirituality, where people now believe in mystical practices and that matter is permeated by living spirit. Such an openness to nature permits the intelligentsia of the 21st century to be open to Buddhism and Hinduism, both who see spirit in nature. And finally, he points to somewhat of a footnote to this, but to modern feminist scholarship, which claim to discover that the God of the Bible, the male God of Judaic religion, was secondary to the original and superiority of goddess nature, which the pagan nations were always worshiping. So there was a diminution of any faith in the Old Testament. Well, how significant is this movement? It's very difficult to establish exactly how much we should take this movement as significant. I attended a weekend in Berkeley. My son went to Berkeley and we called it Berkeley for obvious reasons. I attended a weekend in Berkeley at a conference entitled Transforming Worldviews for the Planetary Era. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, worldviews, didn't postmodernism tell all intellectuals that mega narratives were no longer possible? And here there were 400 intellectuals come together to study worldviews for the planetary era. And frankly, my breath was taken away by the full-scale nature and enormous potential of this pagan offensive movement. There was one particular scholar there, most attractive man by the name of Richard Tarnas. I would recommend you keep your ears open and eventually read his book that he has written called The Passion of the Western Mind. He's almost like the Van Til of paganism. Am I being kind to Van Til? I don't know. Or too nice to him. But his book, The Passion of the Western Mind, is an attempt to take the mind, which of course secular humanists believe is the essence of who we are, and take it through the whole process of history and bring it out on the side of what I'm now calling post-secularism. Now, when he wrote this book, the term post-secular was not in use, but I'm convinced that what he is talking about is precisely that. In this book, he argues that there is a pivotal breaking point in the development of Western culture. Let me give you this quote. "The collective psyche seems to be in the grip of a powerful archetypal dynamic in which the long alienated modern mind, secular humanism, is breaking through out of the contractions of its birth process, out of what Blake called its mind-forged manacles, to rediscover its intimate relationship with nature and the larger cosmos." This is the liberating view of history, you see, that the mind is breaking out of the manacles of secular humanism into this much wider world of nature. So I think that this man is a crucial thinker in the process of the post-secular. He is read in every, as far as I can tell, in every philosophy department in the universities in America. And the head of Google thinks he's a wonderful thinker. So you know where some of these big tech companies will end up. He's arguing that history has a purpose because the cosmos has an inner intelligence. And he wants to lead our minds into the full understanding of what the mind can know. Not simply in secular humanism, which is a narrow and mind-closing approach, but into this broader sense. He argues that what is happening, what has happened to the Western mind in the past, is really a history of men. And he lists all the men involved in the development of the Western mind. And then he argues that the male tends to separate the human being from nature so that the earth becomes disensouled. So that's what masculine thinking has tended to do throughout history. It is a masculine crisis, but the real resurgence is the empowerment of the feminine and of the understanding of the relationship of the mind with nature. So, Tarnas, T-A-R-N-A-S, doesn't use the term post-secular, but he does speak about the emergence of a fundamentally new form of intellectual vision. And here's what he says: various still vital forms of the modern sensibility of the scientific mind, that has to remain, the widespread urge to reconnect with the body, the emotions, the unconscious, the imagination, and intuition, the growing recognition of an immanent intelligence in nature, in the broad popularity of the Gaia hypothesis, increasing appreciation of indigenous and archaic cultural perspectives such as Native American Indians, in the new awareness of feminine perspectives of the divine, the contemporary reemergence of goddess spirituality. That's involved, you see, in the vision. Now, isn't that interesting? Even Native American animism is now included by these rationalistic thinkers, such as himself, that was trained as a secular humanist, now open to the irrationality of animism, and quite proud of it. He talks about human history culminating in a great synthesis. The synthesis is the synthesis of two tendencies in Western history: the autonomous mind of scientism. Autonomous from what? Well, obviously from God, but he thinks that's finally a good thing. The autonomous mind of scientism and the wild spirit of the romantics. So he sees secular humanism and romanticism, you see, as part of this coming together of a new synthesis. So I love his conclusion. The deepest passion of the Western mind has been to reunite with the ground of its being. The deepest passion of the Western mind is to reunite with the ground of its being, namely nature, pantheism. And he says the ultimate synthesis is the union of the rational with the mythical, the normal with the paranormal, the material with the immaterial, the human with the divine. This is classic paganism. It really is. As I say, this man is read all over the Western world. Joseph Campbell, guru to George Lucas, who wrote Star Wars, says he's the most lucid and concise presentation I have read. The chairman of Apple says, this will serve us well into the next millennium. What proof is there that this kind of thinking is or can take place? I was surprised to read a book with the title A Plausible God, Secular Reflections on Liberal Jewish Theology, written by a Jewish atheist philosopher. And he's picking up the new sort of spiritual Judaism based on the Kabbalah and mysticism of all kinds. And he's asking, does this have anything to do with his own atheistic view of things? And he believes, indeed, that this kind of pantheism is is pretty much the same thing as atheistic belief. I think the reason he sees it this way is because both atheism and pantheism reject God the Creator, who is distinct from us and the world. So there's a real possibility, you see, that secular humanists that need spirituality can indeed feel at home with this kind of pantheistic pagan thinking as they seek to live in the modern world. Because in both cases, this Jewish mysticism and atheism reject supernaturalism. They reject the God of the Bible who is distinct from us. And I found some examples of how contemporary atheists are doing this, oddly enough. Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion, calls pantheism sexed up atheism. He's being honest, but that's what he thinks it is. And in a sense, he's right, you see, because pantheism, as I said, has rejected God who is transcendent. And so he finds this quite acceptable. He is in favor of this mystical spirituality, to use his term. I know because I heard him saying it on BBC during the night as I was half awake. Stephen Hawking, like Einstein, identified God with the laws of nature. Sam Harris says we need a positive statement of spiritual experience. He declares in his book, The End of Faith, to celebrate the beginning of a new age of spirituality, the endorsement of mysticism. And so you have in these atheists now an opening to this kind of pagan spirituality without sensing that they're losing anything, and they're gaining a certain amount of spirituality. Harris is involved in focusing on the mind through meditation, fasting, chanting, sensory deprivation, psychotropic drugs. He celebrates the popularity of Western and Eastern occult traditions, from shamanism, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and even Hermeticism. So he's fully into the affirmation of pagan spirituality. Now, as I say, I'm beginning to see this post-secular reality expressing itself in this way. Will it continue? I think I have to believe that we are going through a process of conversion into a pagan worldview in the West. The title of a book published some years ago says it all very succinctly. The title is When God Becomes Goddess, The Transformation of American Religion, 1995. Now, he's talking about America. I imagine the same thing has happened in Australia. We are reassured by this Roman Catholic theologian that religion in America would not disappear. It would simply go through the process of transformation. A new kind of religiosity is poised to take its place. America is changing religions, and since there are finally only two religions, a new kind of religion is the old paganism. So this is indeed what Tarnas has been showing. The West has converted back to paganism. And it's been doing this in a serious way, changing its religion, okay, but as June Singer, a Jungian, said in 1997, that this new view of existence is building its own cosmology based on the joining of the opposites. In other words, there's been a great attempt by these kinds of thinkers to go outside of their own personal experience and to build a cosmology of paganism that the world will have to take account of. And thousands of progressive academics are seeking to work out a coherent pagan cosmology to put the world together again in pagan terms. Now, just as a conclusion, I will simply say that what I have given you is a very tendentious view of history. This does not take into account what I've been trying to teach for a number of years now, that there are only two religions. There's the worship of what, well, I've been teaching it, but obviously it depends upon the Apostle Paul. There are two religions, worship of nature or worship of the creator of nature, Romans 1:25. And that these are the essential elements, and we don't have another choice. And so this history that Tarnas develops, where he simply dismisses biblical theism as a mythology that lost its power in the 18th century. But of course, that view of the world has not lost its power. There are two options. One, the worship of creation, the other, the worship of the Creator. And it seems to me that in our modern world of post-secularism, we need to be able to make the case that yes, there is the worship of nature, but there is another possibility, the worship of the Creator. And I believe that this kind of post-secular thinking, spirituality, really finally does not deliver what it promises. It does not deliver synthesis because it does not account for the whole reality of the Christian faith throughout the last 2,000 years, nor the experience of that reality in the lives of Christians. And so I would encourage you all to, as you think about talking to people around you who may be coming post-secular, that you bring up to them the challenge of integrating, or at least comparing, the Christian notion not of pantheism but of theism, not of oneism but of twoism, not of the worship of nature but of the worship of the Creator who is blessed forever. Thank you very much.